Games Workshop was the biggest miniatures studio at the time. But there was a smaller studio looking to confront them with the crown. And that small studio was Rackham, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at what made them so special. Rackham was a French wargames company that existed in various guises between 1996 and 2010, and they had a flagship game called Confrontation, which was a dark fantasy skirmish wargame set in their world called Arclash. Now this was very much their core game, but they had other games set in the same world around it. So for example, there was one called Ragnarok, which was more of a mass battle game like Warhammer Fantasy. But what really made Rackham special, what really made them stand out, is that everything they made was absolutely beautiful, and in my opinion still stands out as some of the most beautiful wargames products ever made. Now they were certainly ahead of their time in the way they put it all together and the way the pieces all formed. And I don't just mean the miniatures, I mean with how the game was actually started when you were first getting into it. It's really quite incredible looking back at it, especially when you compare it to what everyone else was doing at the time. Now I encountered this quite by accident because at that point I had a friend who was trying to get me into War Machine, and I worked at Games Workshop at that point, so really I was mostly in the Warhammer mould, but I started looking at some other games, encountered Confrontation, and I was just blown away by just how incredible everything looked. Now at that point I didn't have much spending money, but I did try starting to collect it, so I buy bits and pieces, and I built up a little moderate collection really, and in fact some of these models I still have, and many of them I've not even used. So we thought in this video it'd be really fun to get one of those out and paint it up. So I have one that I've actually had in my collection for 15 years now. So here it is. This is a Daciatis clone. It's from the faction The Alchemists of Durs, who are basically evil scientists who mix alchemy and magic as well. And what they do is create weird creatures to fight their wars for them, such as this one, which is like an ogre-sized monster. Now, I think it's really cool. I basically bought it because I love the colour scheme of it and love the style of it. So in this video, what we're going to do is open this up and get it painted. So let's take a look at what you get inside the average Confrontation blister pack. And as I mentioned, this is one that I've had in my collection for more than 15 years, so it's high since time that I got this model built and painted. As I mentioned, this is a Daciatis clone. You can see all the components just there. Quite normal for a blister pack where you'd get this transparent cover so you can see the pieces. But very unusual for the time is that it's plastic all the way around. So instead of a cardboard sheet, you have more plastic seeing more things here, and this means you get a nice picture of the miniature that's inside the set. Now this is actually a card that comes separate here because this is all the stats for the unit that you've just got. So you can see we've got all the stats down here. See what I mean by them all looking really cool with that style that they have. You have your special rules here, and then you've got the points cost of the miniature there as well. On the back you just have the Rackham logo, and this is important because they all had this, because actually what you do is get all the cards for the units in your army. At the start of your turn you'd form a deck of them, and as you drew the card, that was the unit you then had to activate. So you had to sort of plan ahead which order you were going to move all your units in. Now the next thing you get inside here is this little cardboard sheet with some tokens in. And these tokens are all gameplay tokens, so they basically reflect the conditions of your troops, like wounds, orders, that sort of thing. So you just pop them out and you can start playing with those. And then something that's particularly unique that I found here in this game is that inside you'd get a miniature rulebook. Now, like your stat card, this is the size of a Magic the Gathering card, and inside it does contain all the rules to play the game, including examples of play as you go through there. So you and a friend could both buy a single blister pack, and with the contents of it, you could start playing this game straight away. Now, as far as I know, at that time, no one else was doing anything like this. It was really, really cool and really quite a game changer, I think. Now, next thing you'd get is the base of the miniature. This one I think is about a 50mm square, and like a Games Workshop one of the time, underneath you got these little circles. The idea was that you drill a hole through this, so a larger monster like the one that we've got has a plug in the foot which goes through there and just makes it a bit more stable on the base. Now after that, underneath you have the foam, and then there's all the components. So without further ado, it's time to get this model built. here he is now all fully built, and to be honest with you, that was a bit of a challenge. I'd forgotten what it was like to pin the joints on metal miniatures, especially large ones like this with all the heavy parts. In particular, it's very necessary to do that on the sword arm. But now it's all built, it's time to start painting it, and I know I want to paint it in the same sort of way that it appears on the packaging, and also the Paul Bonner artwork of this same creature. So for that reason, I'm going to go outside now and undercoat it with Mechanica Standard Grey Spray. And here is the Daciatis clone, all primed and ready to go. So what I'm going to do is start out by painting the skin, and I want to paint it kind of like you can see on the artwork, and that's got quite a nice little selection of colours on there. So that means I'm going to be doing some wet blending, but to get it going, it's a good idea to start out with a good foundation colour. So for that reason, I'm going to start out with a nice turquoise. Got some sentient turquoise here, and I'm just going to be roughly base coating it on to get started. So for that reason, I've got a medium base coat brush here from Citadel. I'm just going to get some of this thinned and ready, and then it's time to start looking for all the skin. Whenever I'm starting a miniature like this in these early steps, I'm not really concerned about catching smaller details. It's just a matter of getting the main one that I'm looking at this point. So I'm just going to be quickly painting all the skin like this, not worrying if I catch anything else. I've finished applying that initial base coat now, so it's time to start doing some much more organic painting by mixing some colours on the body, because I want to now recreate that sort of mottled appearance that is on the artwork, almost like the body of this creature is really unstable and could fall apart at any moment. So to do that, I'm going to be using 3 colours. I'm going to lean on that original colour I've just applied, so that's going to be sentient turquoise, but now I'm going to introduce a purple into it. Here I'm going to be using some amethyst rain. Also, I want to get a sort of verdigris-like sort of jade green, so here I'm going to use some antiquity green. Now I've got all 3 on the palette, so you can see I've got the colour from the previous step. They were sentient turquoise, and got the other 2 laid out just here. This time I'm using my size 1 brush from Artis Opus, and I'm just going to start out by making sure all 3 paints are thinned and ready to go. So I know sentient turquoise is. I've got the purple ready now, so just a little bit of water, thin down some of that antiquity green as well. And now we're ready. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go at this almost randomly and work it out as I go along by starting out with the initial colour. That's going to be sentient turquoise, and then picking a location to begin on. So let's say, for example, this part here on the back. I'm just going to apply some of this colour, and then every now and then I'm going to switch to another one. So I'm just going to get some on there like that, and whilst it's still wet, I'm just going to jump over to amethyst rain, grab some of that and start applying some of this too. And what I'm going to do is just poke the 2 colours together and let them mix there on the miniature, just to start to create some really interesting tones there like that. And now every now and then I'll then switch to another colour. So I'm going to go back to sentient turquoise now, bring some of that in so I can just blend those 2 colours there like that. And then every now and then I'm going to grab a little bit of antiquity green as well and do the same sort of thing. So for example, a little bit of green around here, again just smudging it as I go along. So now I'm just going to carry on doing this all across the body and just see what sort of effect I come up with. And here we have the result of mixing all those colours on the fly, and to be honest I'm actually really happy with this, because I have been wondering how I'd paint this miniature for years and years and just thinking about all the kind of colours I'd use, so it's quite cool to see them all actually appearing on it now. But now we've got that main set of colours on there, what I'm going to do is add some shading, and for this I'm going to use a darker burgundy colour to again lean into that real unnatural appearance of the creature. So I'm going to use some royal cloak, but those previous 3 colours I have still got some of those available on my wet palette, because as we apply this colour, might need to blend those on the fly as we go along, but we'll see. I'm going to be starting out with the size 0 brush for this one for a bit more accuracy as I put this into recesses. I'm just going to make sure it's thinned down so it's about this sort of consistency here, and then what I'm going to do is just start looking for all the corners and things and running it into those areas. So if we take a look at the arm here, for example, we've got all the muscles. What I'm going to do is just look for those deeper parts and just run a little bit of this colour into those areas. And yes, I do think a tiny bit of blending is going to be necessary. So what I'm going to do, just apply a certain amount there like that, and then just look at those surrounding colours, just grab a little bit of that off the palette and just apply that next to it, just to smudge them together there like that. Now I've got the shading there on the flesh. The next thing to do is add some highlights, and because we've got 3 main tones on the skin, what I'm going to do is apply 3 relevant colours for those and just jump between them as I need to, but the technique's going to be the same throughout. What I've got is some mythic turquoise, some sorcerer's cloak, and then I've also got some cursed blue. And what I'm going to do is apply these using my size 0 brush, and with them I'm aiming to bring out the texture of the flesh. Now what I'll do is go for the purple one first of all, so it's going to be sorcerer's cloak, but all 3 are going to be applied in the same sort of way. What I'm going to do with this is just load up and start looking for the parts that are dominated with the purple tones. So if we take a look at the back, you can see we've got some purples going around this area just here. So I'm looking for that texture where it really stands out on those muscles. what I'm going to do is just apply a few lines running along the length of them like that, just to emphasize that texture. Now, as I start to encounter other colors, what I'm going to do is just switch over to the relevant ones. So you can see now I'm going towards a bit of a green. I'm just going to jump over to some mythic turquoise and apply that around this part just here where the green is prominent. So we're looking at these regions right there, again with those lines. But then as we get more towards the blue, it's time to jump over to cursed blue and do the same sort of thing. And here we have the model with all those highlights now applied. And again, I'm really happy at this stage. I think the color palette's really matching the Paul Bonner artwork that I've got in mind for the palette on the skin. And so with that, what I'm now going to do is start painting all the metal details. And I'm just going to start out with a base coat of a good strong silver. I'm going to use Surcoat Silver here, and then I'm going to put a black wash over the top. Here I'm using Oblivion Black Wash. But I'm going to start out with Surcoat Silver, and I'm going to be applying this mostly with my size 0 brush again. And here I'm just going to be really careful because I want to make sure I just avoid catching any of that skin as I do this. So it's just a matter of making sure the paint's thinned and under control. This is always the case when you're doing this more neat work here, when you're going to put these base coats on, because it can be a bit tricky to get some of them. So it's always a good idea just to look carefully and take your time. So for example, I'm looking at these metal plates, just these ones here in the shoulder. It's going to block them in quite easily on the main flat area, but whenever I get close to that skin, it's time to be really careful and just be neat around this part. Now the base coat's done, I'm going to apply a black wash all over the top. So here I'm using Oblivion Black Wash, again with that size 0 brush, just to keep it under control. The black wash is dry, but before doing any highlighting on the metal, what I now want to do is just add some tints for the colour in there. And to do this, I'm going to use 2 washes. This is because on the example image, again, you get little hints of colour in the metal. So to do this, I'm going to be using both a green wash and a sort of sepia tone. So I'm using Necrosis Green Wash and Archaic Sepia Wash. And both of these are going to be applying at the same time in the same sort of way. I've got my size 0 brush to apply them, and what I'm going to do is just get one of them. So for example, starting with a sepia, and then I'm just going to pick a place at random and apply a small amount of this paint to it. So for example, on the arm just here. Now what I'm going to do is just put on a small amount like that, and then whilst it's still wet, I'm just going to wash my brush, make sure it's damp with only a small amount of water on it, and just use it to draw it out and smudge it around the outside so that it fades into its surroundings. Now with the green, I'm going to be doing the exact same thing, and I'm more or less going to be making this up as I go along really as to where I'm going to be placing these colours. The process is going to be the same throughout, and I'm just going to put some of that colour on, then again quickly wash the brush, make sure it's damp with just a little bit of water, and use it just to smudge it into the colour beyond. Now that's done, we've got that variation there in the metal, so I'm just going to take it a little bit further by adding another tone, but this time it's going to be done a little bit differently because I'm looking for a sort of orangey warm brown to be little bits of rust, and to do this I'm going to use a normal acrylic paint. What I've got is some dry rust brown, so to do this I need to get some on the palette and thin it right down. I'm using my size 00 brush for this one for lots of control. You can see I've got the colour just here. I'm going to make it really runny by adding lots of water to it, bringing it right down to about this sort of thinness just here. And then with this, I'm going to start applying it to little areas where you might get moisture collecting to give the appearance of rust. So for example, if we look at some of the bolts that we've got around here, what I'm going to do is just introduce just a small amount of it into some of the recesses just for a little flash of this warm colour. With that colour dry, I'm now happy with all the tones there and all of that silver, so it's time to highlight it. And here what I'm going to go for is some edge highlighting with a bright silver. I'm going to use some Mithril Blade. And to apply it then, going for the size 00 brush again, because with this kind of technique, it's all about being as neat as possible and getting that paint thinned correctly. So I'm just going to make sure I add the water to it so it's nice and runny. Bring it down to about that sort of consistency so that it flows well from the brush. I'm just going to remove excess paint so that it doesn't go out of control, and then it's time to start looking for all the edges of all the silver details. So if we go for these ones we got up here in the shoulders, for example, what I'm going to do with the tip of the brush is start looking for the edge and follow along as neatly as possible so that we get that bright flash of silver along the edge of each panel. And with that, the armour is now complete, as is the blade of the sword, and I think later on we might add a little bit of blood on top of this, but before that, what we now need to do is just paint in some remaining details on there. And here I'm looking at the leather and the bone. I'm going to start out by base coating the leather with quite a warm brown. I'm going to use some Noble Steed Brown here. Then for the bone, I'm going to be using a dark bone colour. I'm going to use some Dragon Fang. Then both of these are going to get a brown wash at the same time, so here I'm going to go for some Battlemud Wash. But I'm going to start out by base coating that leather with some Noble Steed Brown, and for this I'm going to use my size 0 brush, and now I'm just going to start looking around the model for this feature. These leather details do appear scattered around it, so this is going to be a bit of a tricky stage to actually identify them all, but it's going to be things like the rags that we've got down here, and there's also one that goes around his arm just up here. Now I've got all of that leather, the next thing to base coat is going to be all the bone details. So this is going to be things such as the teeth and claws, and of course this strange bony structure on top of the head. And with those two colours blocked in, it's now time to paint a brown wash over both. So here I'm using some Battlewood wash, and I'm mostly going to be applying this using my size 1 brush. That wash is now dry, so I can move on to highlighting those areas. And I'm going to start out with the leather, and here I'm first of all going to do a highlight using some dry rust brown, so a nice sort of warm brown there. Then just to push it a bit further, I'm going to follow up with a little bit of Wasteland Brown. But I'll start out with dry rust brown, and to apply this one I've gone down to my size 00 brush, and here I'm going to start picking out the texture of that leather by following the edges and any creases that we can find. So for example, if we look at the leather that we've got just down here, what I'm going to do is look for the edges just along here and just start dotting this along with the tip of the brush, just to build up a slightly rough texture there like that. But also we've got all these creases around here. So for these, I'm just going to make sure I angle the model so I'm comfortable. And then with the tip of the brush, just going to follow the very peak of each one like this. And with that done, I'm then going to move on to a finer highlight, this time using Wasteland Brown. And I'm mostly going to be retracing my steps here, only lighter and a bit more of a dotting motion, just to give the appearance of a bit more cracked leather. And there we are, I'm now happy with the leather, so it's time to move on to the next thing, which is going to be the bone details, and here we just need to finish them off. So I'm going to layer them using some Skeleton Legion now, before then highlighting with some Vampire Fang, and this just for a final highlight, especially on the head crest, I'm just going to use a little bit of Trooper White. But first of all, we need some Skeleton Legion, so for this I'm going to be applying it using the size 0 brush, and here this is just going to be a straight up layer. In this case, it's a matter then of applying it onto the flatter regions whilst avoiding recesses. So if I go to the crest on the head just here, that means I'm going to be applying it onto areas like this, always looking for recesses, such as these ridges we've got towards the head down here, just being careful not to drop into the darkest areas. Now that's done, I'm going to move on to highlighting the bone, and here I'm using some Vampire Fang first of all, and with this I'm now looking for all the sharper edges and ridges, and I'm just going to carefully pick them out with a small brush. So here I'm using the size 00, and you can see I'm going for that central almost blade that we've got, and then I'm now on the side and looking for these little ridges that stand out. I'm just going to carefully go down each one. And then I'm going to finish off the bone with a very fine highlight of Trooper White, and this is just going to be on the tip of the crest just to give the appearance of it being really sharp. And with that, the bone is complete, so it's time to move on to some finishing touches, and this will be first of all on the eyes, and here I just want a nice bright green, so I'm going to use some Talisman Green. And once that's done, I'm then going to add a little bit of blood there using some Blood for the Blood God. I'm going to start out with Talisman Green though, and to apply this one, I'm definitely going for the small brush, so the size 00 once again, and with this, just need a very small amount there on the brush so that we got that good point, and then it's time to brace your hands as steady as possible for details like this, because we've just got to go in there and just apply a little dot onto the eyeballs, so just in there. And then finally, I'm just going to add a little bit of Blood for the Blood God. And to begin with, I'm just going to add some around the jaw as if it's bitten something. So a little bit just around there, a few small amounts in between the teeth. And I'm just going to have a few little flecks of it coming down on this iron jaw down here. Just a few little bits there built up like that. And when using this kind of paint, I always like to apply it as a few coats. So the first coat you can see is, well, quite thin, but the next one I'm just going to build on top of that, and it starts to really build up that effect of blood and make it look nice and realistic. I'm also going to add some onto the sword too, and in this case I'm just going to rotate the model around so that I can paint it on almost with a slashing motion to give the appearance that the sword has made some impact with something there like that. Now with this done, it's then time to base the miniature, and in this case I'm definitely going to be going for a desert base, because the labs where this would have been created lie beneath the desert of Saiharhalna. And with the base now fully painted, the Daciatis clone is complete and ready to go and do the will of its evil masters. So the experience of building this miniature and painting it has been fantastic for me because it's been in my collection for such a long time and I've always wondered how exactly I'd paint it, so it's really cool to bring all the ideas to life. Now you might be wondering what happened to Rackham and Confrontation, and it is quite a long and sad story, but needless to say, they're no longer with us and the hobby is all the less for it. But anyway, we really hope you enjoyed this video and we'll see you again very soon.